Continuing our talk on C-sharp coding conventions, I would like to point out the use of predefined type names instead of system type names. So our predefined type names are things like int, string, and bool for different variable types versus system names like int32, string with the capital S, or boolean. The difference here being is when we define them as a system type, we are being very specific as to the actual data type that we want the system to use. Whereas if we use the predefined type names, we allow the compiler to choose and optimize our code to choose the best type for us. So by using these predefined system type names, such as int32, we're actually limiting the .NET Framework's ability to optimize our code at runtime, otherwise known as just-in-time compiling. It also makes the code more natural to read to say int and bool than int32 or int64. Next, let's talk about class names. Class names should be nouns or noun phrases in order to describe what it is that the class does or what it holds. So things like class employee are clear that this is an object of an employee type, or class document collection is pretty explanatory as to the purpose of this class. Avoid verb-like names such as do work or processing. Noun and noun phrases to name a class are easier to remember, more consistent with the standards, and ultimately give us a better idea of the purpose of the class. When working with interfaces, the standard is to start the name of the object with the uppercase letter I. Interface names should still be noun or noun-like phrases, such as class names. They can also be adjectives, since often our interfaces are working between two classes that don't have a relationship already. But to be consistent with the framework and so that we understand the difference between a class and an interface when reading the code, use the uppercase I for interface naming. Let's talk about the placement of our curly brackets. So we always want to align them vertically for every item that we have in our code. As you can see, when you select a particular curly brace, Visual Studio will highlight its partner, but it's ultimately harder to read when we end up with a situation called Egyptian brackets, where one bracket is up at the top with the method header or declaration, and the other one is down at the bottom. So we always want to move these, and Visual Studio will help to get a vertical alignment. This just makes the code easier to read, and it's easier to follow where your curly braces start and end. When laying out a class, there is a specified way in which members in the class should be outlined in order for the best readability. The first thing at the very top of the class should be any public static members first. So if you have public static variables, those go at the very top, first thing in the class. Then any public variables. Private variables also can go at the top underneath your public variables if your class contains any. Then the constructor, and then your properties. Methods would follow below at the bottom of the class and go all the way to the end. Setting up your class this way is the generally accepted practice that prevents the need to hunt for variable declarations and makes sure that we're always setting things up for the proper scope in our classes. Since commenting and documenting our code is such an important part of being a developer, and not only helping us remember the logic and purpose for the code that we have written, but helping people down the line that have to maintain it, let's talk a little bit about commenting conventions. We always want to place comments on a separate line. So in this case, you can see every one of my comments is on a separate line. We don't want to place comments out to the side of the same line. This makes things very hard to read, and sometimes we even have to scroll. Comments should be very readable, and you should use full-length sentences where appropriate. You always want to use good spelling, grammar, and avoid any strange phrases or abbreviations that other people may not understand. So as you work through this C# course, please keep these guidelines in mind, and there are several more at the MSDN resource website for C# coding conventions. But start to think about implementing these and come back and review as you work through so that you can be sure you're writing your code to the standard.